This is a 2002 BMW Z8, and it's one of the coolest modern BMW models.
Although BMW is known for its luxury practical performance cars, this car was different. A low volume production exotic sports car with a manual transmission and the V8 from the BMW M5.
Today, I'm here with Kennan, who's a bit of a BMW expert, and we're going to review the Z8 and show you all of its quirks and features. Before we get started, big news, this Z8 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a truly special car, absolutely beautiful, low production, something of a BMW supercar, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Z8 where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, the BMW Z8. We're going to start with a general overview of this car. Now, it came out in the early 2000s, which was perfect timing. A lot of BMW enthusiasts, like Kennan, believe the early 2000s was BMW's pinnacle era, the golden age, and this car was at the top of the range, the pinnacle of the pinnacle, with a sticker price of around $125,000 to start.
The Z8's design was based on the BMW 507, which was a beautiful two-seat sports car from the late 50s. And this was a real sensation. It stood out from the rest of BMW's line because BMW didn't really do cars like this at that time. Low volume exotic sports cars with a $125,000 sticker price. In fact, the car was such a standout that it actually appeared in a James Bond movie, The World Is Not Enough, where it was famously split in half by a buzzsaw.
Yep, giant saw down the middle. Now, BMW made around 5,700 of these Z8s for the entire world throughout the production run, and about 2,500 of them came here to the United States, like this car.
And next up, we're going to talk about the quirks and features of the Z8, starting with the engine. Now, originally when this car came out, it was only offered with one engine, and that was this, the S62 V8. This was shared with the E39 M5, and it's a great engine. It makes about 400 horsepower and about 370 foot-pounds of torque, and critically, it's mated to a manual transmission, which was also shared with the M5. That meant the Z8 could do 0 to 60 in about 4.5 seconds, which was a solid performance figure for its time. Later in the production cycle, famed BMW tuner Alpina would come out with a grand touring luxury focused version of the Z8. It would be powered by a 4.8-liter M62, which was a variation of an engine shared with the X5 and 7 series of that time. It produced 370 horsepower and about 385 foot-pounds of torque, but critically it was mated with an automatic transmission, which meant that if you wanted the hardcore performance version of the Z8, you had to get the original with the S62. With that said, the Alpina version was actually rare, with only 555 of those being made of the total 5,700 unit production run.
But anyway, next up, onto the rest of the Z8 quirks and features, and despite this car's relatively simple, elegant, beautiful design, it has an enormous amount of bizarre quirks, starting with the key, which you can see doesn't have a little loop so you can attach it to your key ring, which seems like kind of a strange decision, and it is until you discover that this car came with these leather key pouches. You were supposed to unzip the pouch, put your key inside, zip it back up, and then you would attach the leather key pouch to your key ring, as if you wanted to go around with all your house keys and then this leather zippered key pouch that you still had to unzip and pull the key out every time you wanted to unlock the car. It was absolute madness, but that's what BMW somehow envisioned for the keys of the Z8, and things only get stranger from there. On the other side of the key, you can see Z8 is on a little metal plate that's been screwed into the key, almost like they took a regular BMW key and they didn't want to make a separate key for the Z8, so they just screwed in a plate. You walk up to the car, you can see the door handle pretty clearly, but you're wondering where the keyhole is. Well, you flip up this aluminum piece right here, and there is the keyhole. It reveals itself to you hidden until then, and you can stick the key in, twist it, and unlock the door. Of course, this car also has keyless entry if you just want to press a button on the key once you've unzipped it from your pouch. But anyway, next we climb inside the Z8, where we discover a truly enormous enormous amount of unusual quirks and features in here because basically nothing in the Z8 is shared with regular BMW models. Everything was different and everything was strange. Starting with the general layout of this interior. This was a retro-inspired exterior design, but also a retro interior. It was supposed to be simple, basic, not overloaded with screens and technology like cars were becoming at this time. It was really supposed to be a throwback interior. Now, one of the unusual things about this interior is the placement of the gauges directly in the center. They are faced towards the driver, but they are directly in the middle of the dashboard where, well, frankly, you wouldn't really expect them, particularly in a high-performance car like this. Now, directly in front of the steering wheel, where the gauges normally are, you have on the left side the switch for the headlights. You twist it, and the headlights turn on. On the right, you have the keyhole to start the car, placed about where the speedometer would usually be in a normal car. That's weird, but the keyhole situation is even weirder because once you twist it, well, the car doesn't start. You actually have to press a button directly below it labeled engine start, and only then does the V8 roar to life. That's because the Z8 came from this era in the early 2000s where starter buttons were cool, but nobody was making a proximity key yet, so it couldn't tell if the key was in the car. You had to put it in and then press the cool starter button. It actually added a step to simply turning on the car. Now, also in this vicinity, the steering wheel itself is certainly quirky. It doesn't look like basically any other steering wheel. It has these aluminum bars, horizontal in the center and then vertical on the bottom. Very distinctive look, and again, meant to be a retro design, a throwback to the original BMW 507 and other old school steering wheels. Interestingly, that meant no controls of any kind on the wheel. Cruise control, volume, none of that stuff. You just had this cool old school looking steering wheel. But the weirdness has just begun in this interior. Let's move on to maybe the weirdest part about the whole thing, the power window control. Over on the driver's door panel, you can see one switch up, down for the power windows. So you can only roll up and down the one window. It seems odd. Most cars let you do both. And this does as well, but it's controlled with a little toggle switch below the window switch. So you move it over to the left, and then you're controlling the left window. You move the toggle switch over to the right, and then you are controlling the right window with the same window switch. And if you have this toggle switch in the center, you can roll up or down both windows at the same time. So instead of having two window switches, there was just a toggle where you could indicate your preference. Now, amazingly, this toggle also was used to control the mirrors. You put it over on the left, and then you can use this ball below the toggle to adjust the left mirror, and of course, right for right mirror, etc. So this was actually a pretty clever piece of design, again, simplifying this interior. Why use two window switches when you can have just one? And by the way, that window switch makes a second appearance in the driver footwell, where it's hidden kind of under the dashboard. You can see it functions as the trunk opener or the fuel door, depending on which way you press it. That window switch is right back under there. But anyway, back to the door panel. Another rather interesting and quirky item is the storage compartments on the door panel. There's two of them, as you can see, but they don't function the same way. The rear panel pulls out, but then you let go and it automatically closes back up. The front panel pulls out, but then you let go and it stays open. So two different kind of choose your preference storage compartments on the door panel. And speaking of storage, another interesting storage location in this car, behind the seats. You can see two compartments here that actually lock if you want them to. You also had a locking glove box in the Z8, but if you wanted even more locking storage, which might make sense. It's a convertible. You park it with the top down. You want to lock up your stuff. Behind the seats is the place to do it for more storage. And speaking of the seats, here's one of the strangest quirks in the entire car. You can lift up the headrest. Obviously, it's adjustable. Makes sense. But once it's up, how do you put it down? You push on it and nothing happens. That's because putting down the headrest doesn't have a simple button you push. Instead, you squeeze the outer edges of the headrest itself. That releases the headrest, and then you can drop it from there. So you lift it up kind of normally and then squeeze the headrest to push it down. Never seen that before. A very unusual piece of design. And speaking of unusual, here's another one. Accidentally leave on the headlights in the Z8, and it gives you a rather angry warning. Take a listen. That is very different from the usual polite bing, bing you get in a lot of cars. The Z8 is much angrier with you. But one cool thing that happens when you turn on the headlights is the lighting on the gauges. You can see it looks like they are front lit. Instead of backlit like most modern car gauges with the lights behind, they almost look like they're lit from the front in sort of a non-uniform, fading, old school light pattern. It's another retro design theme in this car. Just the gauge lighting is retro. It looks like something you'd see in the 50s, but here it is in the 2000s. And frankly, it looks pretty cool. And speaking of the gauges, you can see the tachometer mounted here in the center with everything else, but mounted inside the tachometer is a clock. You don't often see a tachometer mounted clock, but that is exactly the situation in the quirky Z8. Also around the gauges, worth pointing out, that's where your turn signal lights are. So you put on the signal, you're not reminded of it directly in front of the steering wheel like every other car. Instead, it's in the center showing you the turn signal is on, so you gotta kind of be looking for it. Same deal, you turn on the headlights or the high beams, all of those indicator lights are in the center, letting you know that that stuff is on. Next up, another interesting quirk in the rear view mirror. At the bottom, you can see this red, well, it almost looks like a light. It's actually a sensor for the keyless remote. When you press the button, this red piece senses what you're doing and communicates it to the car. But it also has another function. If you're in the car and you want to turn on the map lights, you twist this red keyless remote sensor, and then the map lights come on. Twist it again, and the map lights go off. Again, here's a way that BMW eliminated one more button by integrating this function into this sensor the car already had to have. But anyway, next up, moving further down into this car and in the center console, you can see, well, for one thing, the 6-speed manual transmission. This was not an option in this car. It's how all the Z8 models came, except for the Alpina, like Kennan mentioned. Those were all automatics. The standard Z8 was only offered with a 6-speed manual. Also in the center console, you can see dual ashtrays. Open up this compartment, and there's an ashtray for the driver's side, compartment on the passenger side. Dual ashtrays in this car. So driver and passenger wanted to smoke at the same time. They could, and they didn't have to fight over who could use the ashtray. Directly behind that in the center console, a little bit more storage, which again added some practicality to this interior. Next up, moving on to the center control stack in this car, you have below the central climate vents, the climate controls, which are small and very minimally labeled. Just as an example, the hot cold dial only has little marks for red and blue instead of a giant line of red and blue going across. They wanted to keep things, again, minimalist, old school, retro in this car, and they didn't want to go too heavy with labeling. A good example of keeping things retro and simple is the radio, which at first glance doesn't exist. You look around here, you can't see it. It's actually hidden behind this panel. You pop it open and there's your radio. So if you didn't want to have it visible, you could just send it out of the way and keep the interior more classy. But once it's open, you'll discover this is not merely a radio, it's also a navigation system, and the function of it is tremendously frustrating. If you've used a modern touchscreen, the concept of going to each little item and scrolling through a keypad of letters and numbers to enter an address is just completely untenable. It was a very early attempt at a navigation system without using a large screen. They didn't want to clutter this interior, but they wanted to give you the finest technology, which apparently at some point this was. Now, also located under the panel that hides the radio, you'll see a button here marked DSC, which stands for Dynamic Stability Control. If you want to turn off your stability control, that's where you do it. Another button hidden and out of the way. Below that, you have 4 very visible buttons here, front and center, in the center console. A couple of them pretty obvious, the hazard lights, of course, and next to that, the power door locks, but you also have a sport button here. Big silver, says sport, you push it, and then you're in sport mode. Over on the right side of these buttons is a switch, and this controls the convertible top. You can see up, the top is closed, and down, the top is open, and, well, take a look at the top doing its thing. Now, interestingly, when the top is open, you can let it just sit there, down, doing its thing, or if you prefer a more elegant, classier look, you can install a tonneau cover on top of it that sort of hides the roof itself and gives it a more luxurious look. When you pull off this tonneau cover, it actually folds in half, which is a pretty cool idea because then it gets small enough that you can store it in the trunk when you're not using it. And then when you're ready to use it again, just unfold it, stick it back on for your more attractive exterior look.
Moving back to the outside, things remain weird, and we can't talk about the Z8 without talking about its lighting situation. Now, this car predates LED lighting, but BMW wanted to give it a beautiful look using lighting elements, and they did this by using neon. That's right, this car uses neon lights like a sign you would find in Times Square advertising that a business was open. Up front, this car uses neon to illuminate the turn signals, which looks really great and very crisp, and as you move down the car, it also uses it for the turn signals on the side and these beautiful chrome grills. Getting to the back of the car, it uses it here as well in the taillights, and all of these lighting elements together still look very clean and crisp today, despite not being LEDs. Continuing with the idea of weird lighting, when you move to the back of the Z8, you might notice there's no obvious reverse light, and that's because it's hidden. There are these 2 red lights on the back of the car, but one of them is actually the reverse light. When you put the car in reverse, it illuminates and it shows up as white to show that this car is in reverse. Kind of an unusual hidden touch, but it maintains the beautiful symmetry on the back of this car. Staying with the theme of lighting, we move back to the front of the Z8 where we look at the headlights. Now, these look like conventional, very simple headlights, but BMW actually removed the high beams and put them in the grille. This is an unusual place to put them, as most people would think that these are the fog lights, but they're actually the high beams. Now, speaking of the grills in the front, these grills were inspired by the beautiful 507 that we talked about earlier. They're these elongated sideways grills that just harken back to this beautiful design. Another design element that's shared with the 507 is these fender vents that are located on both sides of the car. Now, these house the neon turn signals that I mentioned before, but they also house individual BMW logos, in case you were confused on what this car is. BMW would later bring these back on cars like the E46 M3 and the E60 M5, but it started here with the Z8 as an homage to the BMW 507. And next up, I wanted to talk about this car's overall beauty because it is just that. It is breathtakingly pretty, with its long front hood, its steeply raked windshield, and its simple camtail. This is a beautiful looking car. When it came out, manufacturers were starting to get back into the idea of bringing back retro designs, and BMW was one of the first to go back into their archives and bring out a beautiful shape. To celebrate the new millennium, BMW brought back this 507 shape, and they couldn't have picked a more beautiful car to modernize. It's elegant and sophisticated, and it has aged tremendously well, and it goes down in history as one of the most beautiful roadsters of all time. As for colors, BMW offered a number of options for this car, but most are black, silver, or red. However, they offered gray and blue as well, in addition to some very unusual individual colors, which are exceedingly rare. And next up, we move to the trunk. Now, this is a surprisingly cavernous trunk. You can actually put stuff back here, and that's part of the design of this car. BMW wanted you to use it. You can easily put a weekend bag or some luggage to go on a weekend trip. If you lift up the floor, you find even more storage space under here, and this is also where the battery lives. Now, BMW put the battery here for better weight distribution because it's large and weighs a lot. Also living in this space is the toolkit. Now the toolkit's one of my favorite aspects of this car, as it's this beautiful leather tool roll that has Z8 gently embossed on the cover, which looks incredible. As you open up the tool, you find your basic things in here, your pliers and wrenches and things like that, if you want to work on your Z8. And speaking of working on your Z8, when this car came out, BMW announced that it would offer a 50-year part supply. They did this to increase confidence in buying the car, but also keep values high as they realized that it was a special car. This has turned out to be a controversial point because some parts for this car are not so easy to get these days. But at least the engine remains serviceable as it was shared with the mighty E39 M5.
All right, time to drive the Z8.
I love the Z8. As a BMW fanboy, truly, like, this car is exceptional.
Especially because you own the sedan version.
I do. I've owned an E39 M5 for almost 8 years now, and it's truly one of, if not my favorite car of all time. So to be in a car with the same drivetrain that looks even better, and more importantly is a convertible.
Right. This is like an exotic car version of the E39 M5.
Exactly.
It's bizarre. It's like the E39 M5 in supercar form.
Right. When looking at this, it's like so much, the sounds are all the same. Like, I'm used to that sound in the M5, and this car, it's just like...
It is weird though that even though that's true, the interior isn't even slightly similar.
No, the interiors are, the experience is very different.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit of a different feel. You got the gauges in the center, which never made any sense to anybody.
But as cool as the E39 M5 is, like, this is, you said it before, it's the peak of the peak. This is really
Because
special.
in 01, now this is in 02, but it's the same stuff. BMW made their, in the opinion of BMW people like yourself, they made their best cars. This car and this powertrain is relatively reliable compared to some of the other powertrains.
Yes, I can attest to that. A lot of these don't have miles on them, but I've talked to people who have 150,000 miles on
their Z8. How many miles do you have on your M5? Same power.
220,000.
220 and going. All right, let's do this. Powertrain, smooth. It's not the fastest car in the world, but that wasn't the intent of the Z8. It wasn't supposed to be, like, I call it a supercar. I've called it that a couple times, but like only because it was super low production and it's expensive. Right. Really, it was supposed to be like a roadster, not a Grand Tour. I don't want to say that either because it wasn't that luxury focused. It was like a fun roadster, but it didn't have to be like a crazy, 700 horsepower supercar. That wasn't the goal.
Right, and I think that was kind of reflected at the time. People didn't really know what to make of it. It had an M engine, but it wasn't like an out sports car. It was kind of a weird spot in the middle. But now, 20 years later, it still feels fast. Like, it still feels very powerful.
I agree, it does. It feels fast, not knock your face off fast. Right. But I really think that fits with the car. When you look at the car, it's not daring, it's beautiful. And so when you drive the car, it's not, holy crap, I'm gonna die 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. Right. It's manageable, smooth, manageable.
Like, it's still 400 horsepower is still, or thereabouts, is like enough power to have fun. The road in particular, which is the whole purpose of this car, is a road car.
Yep.
It's just excellent.
Woo! Yeah, this is actually more fun than I remember. I drove one of these years ago for a video, long before like my current format or whatever. And one thing I really love about it is the clutch and shifter action is actually quite something. I often complain that modern BMWs are kind of kinked in their clutch. You get like a whoop, and I don't like that. This car is very smooth. I guess this must be your car, because I haven't driven an E39 M5 in ages.
You'll have to drive mine eventually. Well, we'll have to do one thing before we get back on the highway here, and that's hit the sport button.
Oh, yeah. So now we're sporting.
It should give you more accurate throttle response.
Oh, you think, does that what that does?
That's what that does, yeah. It changes the throttle mapping a little bit.
Well, it feels sporty, let me tell you.
I'm sure it does. But
you got a great sound.
Sonorous.
Nice V8, sonorous. Nice.
You like that one?
It's so smooth. The power delivery is smooth. Oh,
that's
God.
The thing I've taken away with this engine. That the throttle response is so accurate. It has individual throttle bodies. And it's just a joy to use. Whether you're just puttering around town, you have the torque to do that.
Yeah.
As soon as you start to wring it out, it has the horsepower. So it's a really sweet blend. And it's just
it's also a very drivable car. For an exotic or a supercar, whatever you want to say, it's clearly an exotic car, given the values and how rare they are. It's like super just like sit in it and then drive it. I'm impressed with the handling to an extent I didn't expect to be either. It's 20 plus year old BMW. BMW has always built great cars. Not sports cars. They build sporty cars, performance cars.
Well, their thing is they take a sedan and
make it sport,
something sporty.
Yeah, I'm impressed with this car. It doesn't feel as like big Grand Tourer as I kind of thought. It's more of a focused sports car than I thought, but still feels very usable. Got a lot of interior space, nice looking interior, decent technology, at least for the time.
And it's just special. Like, this car is really special.
And beautiful. And there are very few cars, I know it's expensive, but there are very few cars you can drive around. I mean, one of the most beautiful cars, in my mind, ever.
Yeah, and it's
modern cars especially. I think it's one of the most beautiful. Oh,
it really sits at like the equilibrium of fun, fast, cool, and just like special.
Yeah, and exotic. That's right. That's right. I always talk about how the Ford GT is a drivable exotic car, and that's also true for this car.
It's funny that you mentioned that about the Ford GT, another homage car that also happens to drive excellently.
But that car is such a focused, hardcore sports car. This was more of like, I don't want to say this is a cruiser because it's more sports car than I was expecting it would be, but it's definitely less of like an insane, crazy, we're gonna die kind of situation.
And so that's the BMW Z8. This car is seriously cool with 3 pedals, gorgeous styling, and E39 M5 power. These cars are hard to find, but you can find this one for sale on Cars and Bids.
And now it's time to give this Z8 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 62 out of 100, which places the Z8 here against some contemporaries. The Z8 is an interesting car. It's very rare and special for a BMW, but not especially rare by ultra-exotic car standards. It's beautiful, but not incredibly fast. It's tremendously quirky and special, yet it didn't have its own distinct powertrain. The market has never really known where to value this car, and its values have swung up and down, but it's certainly special, definitely beautiful, and more fun to drive than I expected.